The sheriff's deputy was standing at my front door at 7 in the morning, looking apologetic but official, while behind him I could see Karen Whitmore practically vibrating with satisfaction on my lawn. I had moved to Meadowbrook Estates in northern Georgia 3 years ago, buying a modest ranch-style home on 2 acres at the edge of the subdivision. The property backed up to undeveloped land, which was perfect for my needs. I'm Xavier Vaughn, and I'm a commercial beekeeper. When I purchased the house, I made absolutely certain that my beekeeping operation was legal. I checked county ordinances, state regulations, and even hired a lawyer to review everything. My 6 beehives sat in a carefully maintained apiary 200 feet from my nearest neighbor, surrounded by a privacy fence and flowering plants. Everything was by the book. "Mr. Vaughn," the deputy said, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm Deputy Martinez. We received a complaint about dangerous animals on your property." "Dangerous animals," I repeated, genuinely confused for a moment before it clicked. "You mean my bees?" she said. "Their bees, yes, sir." He glanced back at Karen, who had her arms crossed and was wearing what I'd come to recognize as her trademark HOA enforcer expression. "I have to investigate any complaint we receive." I sighed and stepped aside. "Come on in. Let me get you the documentation." "Everything I'm doing is completely legal." Karen tried to follow us inside, but Deputy Martinez held up a hand. "Madam, please wait outside." Her face flushed red. "I'm the HOA president. I have a right to see what's happening on properties in my subdivision." "No, madam, you don't." "Please step back." Martinez's tone was polite but firm. I went to my home office and pulled out a thick folder I'd prepared specifically for situations like this. Inside were copies of my county permits, my Georgia beekeeping registration, proof of liability insurance, documentation showing my hives were the proper distance from property lines, and a letter from my lawyer confirming everything was legal. I also grabbed a copy of the property deed and the original HOA covenant I'd received when I bought the house. Martinez reviewed everything carefully, taking his time. He was thorough, I'd give him that. After about 15 minutes, he looked up at me. "Everything here looks in order, Mr. Vaughn. You're well within your rights to keep bees on your property. The setback distance exceeds county requirements. You've got all the necessary permits, and I don't see any violations." "That's what I thought," I said, relief washing over me. "I did my homework before I moved here." We walked back outside together. Karen immediately straightened up, clearly expecting vindication. "Madam, Mr. Vaughn is in compliance with all county and state regulations," Martinez said. "There's nothing illegal happening here." Karen's jaw dropped. "But the HOA rules specifically prohibit dangerous animals and commercial businesses operated from homes." I pulled out my copy of the HOA covenant. "Actually, they don't. I reviewed these before I purchased the property. The covenant mentions domestic animals like dogs and cats, with limits on numbers and breeds. It says nothing about bees or beekeeping. As for commercial business, the restriction is on businesses that generate significant traffic or require modifications to the home's exterior. My beekeeping operation doesn't involve customers coming to the property, and my hives are in the backyard, not visible from the street." Martinez nodded. "He's right, madam. I've reviewed his documents. There's no violation here." "This is ridiculous." Karen's voice was rising. "Those things are dangerous. What if someone gets stung? What if a child wanders back there?" "My property is fenced and posted with appropriate signage," I said calmly. "The hives are in a secured area. Honeybees are generally docile and don't attack unless their hive is threatened. I've been keeping bees for 15 years and I've never had an incident." "I want them removed," Karen demanded, Martinez shook his head. "Madam, that's not going to happen. Mr. Vaughn isn't breaking any laws. This is a civil matter between you and your HOA, but from what I can see, he's not violating your covenants either. I suggest you consult with your HOA attorney if you want to pursue this further." Karen glared at me like I'd personally offended her entire bloodline. "This isn't over, Mr. Vaughn. I'll be bringing this to the HOA board meeting next week. We'll see what the other board members have to say about this hazard in our neighborhood." She stormed off to her white Lexus SUV and peeled out of my driveway with more drama than necessary. Martinez gave me a sympathetic look. "Sorry you had to deal with that on a Tuesday morning," he said. "It's not your fault. Thanks for being professional about it." After he left, I stood in my driveway for a moment, looking at my property. The morning sun was warming up, and I could hear the gentle hum of my bees starting their daily work. They'd be visiting the wildflowers along the property line, the clover in the lawns, the vegetable gardens scattered throughout the neighborhood. That was the irony Karen didn't understand. My bees were probably responsible for pollinating half the plants in Meadowbrook Estates. I'd noticed it over the past 3 years. When I first moved in, several neighbors had complained about poor yields in their vegetable gardens and fruit trees that didn't produce much. Mrs. Chen, 3 houses down, had mentioned her tomato plants barely produced anything. The Hendersons across the street said their apple trees looked pretty, but only gave them a handful of apples each year. The common areas had flowering plants that seemed lackluster. Then I brought in my hives. The next growing season, everything changed. Mrs. Chen's tomato plants were overflowing. The Hendersons got so many apples they started giving them away. The common area gardens that the HOA paid a landscaping company to maintain suddenly burst into vibrant displays of flowers. The difference was dramatic and undeniable, at least to anyone who understood how pollination worked. But Karen Whitmore didn't care about facts or biology. She cared about control. She'd been HOA president for 5 years, and in that time, she'd made it her personal mission to enforce every tiny rule and create new ones where none existed. She'd sent violation notices to people for having their garbage cans visible from the street an hour after pickup time. She tried to fine the Robinsons for painting their shutters navy blue instead of the approved slate blue. She'd attempted to ban children from playing in their own front yards because she deemed it unsightly. Most people in the neighborhood just tried to stay off her radar. I'd managed that successfully for 3 years by keeping to myself and maintaining my property impeccably. My lawn was always mowed, my house was freshly painted, my driveway was clean. I gave her no ammunition, but somehow she'd found out about my bees. I later learned it was because she'd decided to do a property inspection from the street using binoculars, which was both creepy and probably illegal. She'd spotted one of my hive boxes from an angle through the trees when the leaves were thin. The following Tuesday evening, I attended the HOA board meeting. I normally avoided these things like the plague, but Karen had specifically mentioned I'd be discussed, and I figured I should be there to defend myself. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland building near the Subdivision entrance that mostly hosted birthday parties and book clubs. About 30 residents were there, which was more than usual. Word had spread that there was going to be drama. I recognized most faces, though I didn't know everyone's names. I'd kept mostly to myself, focused on my bees and my small pollination business. Karen sat at the front table with 4 other board members. There was Dale Murphy, the vice president, who always looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. Sandra Mitchell, the secretary, who dutifully took notes and never expressed an opinion. Robert Chen, the treasurer and husband of Mrs. Chen who loved her tomatoes. And finally, Patricia Donovan, a member-at-large who'd lived in the subdivision since it was built 20 years ago. Karen called the meeting to order and rushed through the standard business, approving last month's minutes, discussing the landscaping budget, addressing a complaint about someone's mailbox. Then she got to what she'd clearly been waiting for. Item 7 on the agenda, the illegal beekeeping operation at 247 Oakmont Drive. "It's not illegal," I said immediately from my seat in the third row. Karen's eyes snapped to me. "You'll have your turn to speak, Mr. Vaughn. Right now, I'm presenting the issue to the board." She turned to the others. "As I discovered last week, Mr. Vaughn has been operating a commercial beekeeping business from his property, in direct violation of our HOA covenants. He has at least 6 hives containing potentially millions of dangerous insects. This poses a serious threat to the safety of our residents, particularly children and anyone with bee allergies." "That's not accurate," I said, standing up. "May I address the board?" Dale looked relieved to have someone else talking. "Please, go ahead." I walked to the front and pulled out copies of the same documents I'd shown Deputy Martinez. "I've made copies for each board member. As you'll see, I have all required permits and registrations for beekeeping in Fulton County. My operation is fully compliant with state and local laws. Additionally, I've reviewed our HOA covenant thoroughly, and there is no provision that prohibits beekeeping. The sections on animals refer specifically to traditional pets. The sections on commercial businesses refer to operations that generate customer traffic or require exterior modifications to properties. My beekeeping does neither." I handed the documents to each board member. Robert Chen looked through his copy with interest. Patricia Donovan read carefully, her expression neutral. Sandra Mitchell glanced at hers and set it aside. Dale Murphy actually read the whole thing, nodding occasionally. "Furthermore," I continued, "honeybees are not dangerous insects. They're essential pollinators that benefit the entire neighborhood. In fact, I'd argue my bees have significantly improved property values by enhancing the gardens and landscaping throughout Meadowbrook Estates." "That's absurd," Karen snapped. "Your bugs have nothing to do with anyone's gardens." "Actually, they have everything to do with gardens." I pulled out my phone and brought up photos I'd taken over the past 3 years. "This is Mrs. Chen's garden 3 months before I moved in. This is her garden 6 months after I moved in. Same location, same plants, dramatically different yield. That's what pollinators do." Robert Chen leaned forward, interested. "Martha did mention her garden got better. She wasn't sure why." "It's because pollination rates in this subdivision were probably poor before I arrived," I explained. "We're in a relatively developed area with limited natural habitat for native pollinators. My honeybees supplement the wild pollinator population, which benefits every flowering plant in the neighborhood. Your fruit trees, vegetable gardens, ornamental flowers, everything. Even the grass lawns benefit because bees pollinate clover, which naturally fertilizes the soil." Karen's face was getting red. "This is irrelevant. The safety issue remains. What happens when someone gets stung?" "Honeybees rarely sting unless their hive is directly threatened," I said. "They're foraging insects. When they're out collecting pollen and nectar, they're docile. I've been keeping bees for 15 years across 3 states. I've never had an incident with a neighbor. My bees have never swarmed. I manage my hives professionally." Patricia Donovan spoke up. "Mr. Vaughn, what about people with allergies? That's a legitimate concern." "It is," I agreed. "But the reality is that bees exist everywhere, not just in my yard. There are wild honeybee colonies, bumblebees, carpenter bees, and dozens of other species throughout Georgia. Someone with a severe bee allergy needs to carry an EpiPen regardless of whether I have hives. My bees don't increase the risk significantly because bees are already present in the environment. But your bees increase the population, Karen argued. Marginally, yes. But they also tend to stay close to my property because I provide ideal foraging conditions. I plant specific flowers that bees prefer. My bees are actually less likely to bother neighbors because they have abundant resources right here. Dale Murphy cleared his throat. Has anyone actually had a problem with the bees? Any complaints before this week? Silence. A few people shook their heads. Finally, Tom Henderson stood up. I live across from Mr. Vaughn. I've never had any issues with bees. Actually, my apple trees have been incredible the last few years. We got over 100 pounds of apples last season. Before that, we were lucky to get 20 pounds. Another resident, a younger woman I didn't know well, raised her hand. I have a bee allergy. I carry an EpiPen. I've lived here for 2 years and I've never had a problem. I see bees in my garden sometimes, but they ignore me. More people started speaking up. The Robinsons talked about their improved rose garden. Someone else mentioned their pumpkin patch had actually produced pumpkins for the first time in years. Mrs. Chen stood up and enthusiastically praised her tomato harvests. Karen looked increasingly frustrated. This is beside the point. The point is that Mr. Vaughn is running a business from his home, which violates our covenants. Robert Chen looked up from the documents I'd provided. Karen, I'm looking at the covenant language. Section 12, paragraph 3 specifically states that prohibited home businesses are those that generate regular customer traffic, require signage visible from the street, involve modifications to the home's appearance, or create noise disturbances. Mr. Vaughn's beekeeping doesn't meet any of those criteria. He sells honey. That's a business. I sell honey to commercial customers wholesale, I clarified. I have contracts with local farmers markets and a few restaurants. They pick up from me maybe once a month. No different than if I sold something on eBay occasionally. The covenant doesn't prohibit residents from having any income-generating activities, just businesses that impact the neighborhood negatively. Dale Murphy nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. We can't prohibit someone from having a side business if it doesn't affect anyone else. Half the people in this room probably do some kind of work from home. Karen was losing control of the meeting and she knew it. I'm calling for a board vote to amend the covenants to explicitly prohibit beekeeping and any activities involving insects. You can't just amend the covenants, Patricia Donovan said, sounding tired. That requires a vote of the entire HOA membership, not just the board. And it requires a 2/3 majority. You know this, Karen. Fine. Then I'm calling for a special meeting to vote on a covenant amendment. That still doesn't affect Mr. Vaughn's existing operation, Robert pointed out. You can't apply a new rule retroactively. Even if the membership voted to ban beekeeping, which I doubt they would based on this response, Mr. Vaughn would be grandfathered in. I could see Karen's jaw clenching. She wasn't used to not getting her way. This board has a responsibility to protect the safety of our residents. I agree, Patricia said. But we also have a responsibility to be fair and follow our own rules. Mr. Vaughn has done everything legally and properly. Unless someone can show actual harm or a clear violation of our existing covenants, we have no grounds to take action. Dale looked around the table. I move that we take no action regarding Mr. Vaughn's beekeeping operation, as it's in compliance with all applicable laws and covenants. Second, Robert said immediately. All in favor? Patricia asked. Dale, Robert, and Patricia all raised their hands. Sandra Mitchell hesitated, glanced at Karen, and then reluctantly raised her hand as well. Karen sat with her arms crossed, glaring. "Motion passes 4-1, Patricia announced. "Mr. Vaughn, you're free to continue your beekeeping. Karen, this matter is closed." I thanked the board and returned to my seat. The meeting continued with a few more mundane items, but I could feel Karen seething at the front table. This definitely wasn't over, at least not for her. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me. Tom Henderson shook my hand and thanked me for whatever I was doing to help his apple trees. Mrs. Chen asked if she could buy honey directly from me, which I politely declined since I didn't want to create any appearance of running a retail business from my home. But I did tell her I'd bring her a complimentary jar as a neighborly gift. Others expressed support and curiosity about the bees. As I was walking to my truck, I heard sharp footsteps behind me. I turned to find Karen approaching, her expression furious. "You think you won tonight," she said, her voice low and angry. "But I will find a way to get those bees removed. This is my neighborhood, and I won't have it infested with insects. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not trying to fight with you. I'm just trying to live my life and do my work. My bees aren't hurting anyone." "We'll see about that," she said and walked away. I drove home unsettled. I'd dealt with difficult people before, but there was something about Karen's determination that worried me. She wasn't going to let this go. Over the next week, things escalated. I started receiving violation notices from the HOA for increasingly ridiculous things. My mailbox was apparently 3 inches too far from the street. My house number wasn't visible enough from the road, even though it had been fine for 3 years. My recycling bin was left out 45 minutes past the allowed time on trash day. Each violation came with a warning and the threat of fines. I documented everything, took photos with timestamps, and responded to each notice with evidence showing I was in compliance. The mailbox had been installed by the previous owner and hadn't moved. My house numbers met the county requirements for visibility. The recycling bin was put away at 7:30 in the morning, exactly when I'd always put it away. But the harassment continued. Then things got worse. I came home from running errands one Saturday afternoon to find Karen in my backyard. She was standing about 10 feet from my hives, taking photos with her phone. "What are you doing on my property?" I called out, walking quickly toward her. She didn't even look embarrassed. "Documenting the nuisance. This is HOA business. This is trespassing. You need to leave immediately." The HOA has the right to inspect properties for covenant violations. "No, you don't. Not without notice and permission. That's the law. Get off my property now or I'm calling the sheriff." She gave me a cold smile. "Go ahead. We'll see what they say about your aggressive behavior." I pulled out my phone and dialed. Karen's smile faltered. She walked past me toward the side gate, but not before saying, "Those hives are a disaster waiting to happen. When someone gets hurt, it'll be on you." I reported the trespassing to the sheriff's department. A different deputy came out and took my statement. He advised me to install security cameras, which I did that same evening. I put up 4 cameras covering all angles of my property, including the backyard where my hives were located. The cameras proved invaluable. 3 days later, at 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I checked the camera feed and saw a figure in dark clothing approaching my hives. I couldn't see the face clearly, but the body shape and movement looked like Karen. I called 911 immediately and reported someone on my property attempting to vandalize my equipment. Then I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, though I stayed on my back porch rather than confronting the intruder directly. The figure was doing something near the hives. I shouted, "I've called the police. They're on their way." The figure startled and ran toward the back fence, climbing over it clumsily and disappearing into the woods beyond my property. Within minutes, a sheriff's car arrived. This time it was Deputy Martinez again, along with a female deputy named Lopez. I showed them the camera footage. The video clearly showed someone approaching the hives, though the face wasn't visible. The person had been carrying something, but I couldn't tell what. "Let's check the hives," Martinez suggested. We approached carefully with flashlights. Immediately, I saw the problem. Someone had tried to knock over one of the hives. It was tilted at a dangerous angle but hadn't completely fallen. The bees inside were getting agitated. I could hear the increased buzzing even in the cool night air. "Don't get too close," I warned. "If that hive is damaged, the bees will be defensive." There was also a bottle on the ground near the hives. Martinez photographed it carefully before picking it up with gloved hands. It was a bottle of insecticide, the kind meant for killing wasps and hornets. "Looks like someone was planning to poison your bees," Lopez said. "Or at least trying to kill them," I agreed, feeling sick. "If they'd sprayed that into the hive entrance, they could have killed thousands of bees." "You have any idea who might have done this?" Martinez asked, though his tone suggested he had a pretty good idea. "I have suspicions, but I can't prove anything from the video." "Does your HOA president have a white Lexus SUV?" "Yes," Martinez nodded slowly. "There's a white Lexus parked about a quarter-mile down the road. We passed it on the way here. Seems odd at this time of night." They went to check it out while I carefully began the process of stabilizing the tilted hive. It was delicate work, even in daylight, but in the middle of the night with stressed bees it was particularly challenging. I managed to get it secured without getting stung, though it was a close call. 20 minutes later, the deputies returned. With them, in handcuffs, was Karen Whitmore. She was wearing dark clothing and had leaves in her hair from her escape through the woods. "This is harassment," she was yelling. "I was just taking a walk." "Madam, you have the right to remain silent," Lopez said calmly. "I suggest you use it." Martinez approached me. "We found her trying to get to her car. She has scratches consistent with pushing through brush, and soil on her shoes that looks similar to the soil in your backyard. We're taking her in for trespassing and attempted vandalism. The insecticide bottle will be processed for fingerprints." "I want my lawyer," Karen demanded. "You'll have the opportunity to call one from the station," Martinez assured her. I watched as they put her in the patrol car. Part of me felt bad, but a larger part was just angry. She tried to kill my bees, thousands of living creatures, just because she couldn't control me. The next morning, I had to call an emergency beekeeping supply company to come help me properly assess the damage to the hive. Thankfully, the colony inside was intact. They were stressed but alive. The hive box itself had some damage that needed repair, but it was manageable. News of Karen's arrest spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire. By noon, I'd had a dozen neighbors stop by or call to ask what happened. I gave them the basic facts without editorializing. Karen had been arrested for trespassing on my property and attempting to vandalize my beehives. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for that evening. I attended, curious about what would happen. Dale Murphy was running the meeting, looking deeply uncomfortable in the leadership role. "As you've all heard, Karen Whitmore was arrested last night," he began. "I've spoken with our HOA attorney about the situation. Given the serious nature of the charges and the conflict of interest involved, the board is voting tonight on whether to remove Karen from her position as president pending resolution of the criminal case." "She hasn't been convicted of anything," Sandra Mitchell pointed out. "She'd always been loyal to Karen." "True," Patricia Donovan said. but she's accused of vandalizing a homeowner's property in her capacity as HOA president. That's an enormous liability for the association. If Mr. Vaughn decided to sue the HOA, we could all be on the hook financially. Robert Chen nodded. Our insurance might not cover criminal acts committed by board members. We need to protect the association. The vote was held. Dale, Patricia, and Robert voted to remove Karen as president immediately. Sandra abstained. The motion passed. We'll need to elect a new president, Dale said, though he looked like he'd rather eat glass. I nominate Patricia. Patricia was elected unanimously, including Sandra's vote. Patricia then made a motion to issue a formal apology to me on behalf of the HOA, and to confirm in writing that my beekeeping operation was approved and protected under the covenants. That passed as well. After the meeting, Patricia approached me. She was probably in her 60s, with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Mr. Vaughn, I want to apologize personally for what you've been through. Karen let her need for control override her common sense and decency. The board will not interfere with your beekeeping or your life. In fact, I'd like to propose that you give a presentation about bees and pollination at our next regular meeting. I think a lot of residents would be interested, and it might help people understand why what you do is valuable. I agreed, touched by the gesture. Patricia struck me as the kind of person who'd been watching Karen's behavior for years, waiting for the right moment to push back. Over the next few weeks, the legal case against Karen proceeded. The insecticide bottle had her fingerprints on it. The camera footage, while not showing her face clearly, showed someone matching her build and gait. Her car had been found near my property at 2 in the morning, and she had no credible explanation for why she was there. Her own lawyer apparently advised her to take a plea deal. She was charged with criminal trespassing, attempted vandalism, and attempted destruction of agricultural animals, which in Georgia could be a serious offense since bees are considered livestock. She eventually pleaded guilty to misdemeanor trespassing and agreed to pay restitution for the damage to my hive equipment. She was sentenced to 50 hours of community service and 2 years of probation. She was also required to stay at least 500 feet away from my property as a condition of her probation. The HOA board formally removed her from all positions. She tried to fight it, threatened to sue, but her lawyer talked her down. The optics of an HOA president criminally targeting a homeowner were terrible, and any lawsuit would have just drawn more negative attention to her behavior. I gave my presentation about bees at the following month's HOA meeting. I brought an observation hive, a special clear box that lets you see the bees working inside without risk of stings. I explained how pollination works, showed photos of the life cycle of a honeybee, and talked about the challenges facing pollinators nationwide. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People asked thoughtful questions. Several residents mentioned they'd noticed more butterflies and birds in their yards over the past few years, and I explained that was likely because the increased flower pollination created more seeds and insects, which supported the broader ecosystem. Mrs. Chen stood up toward the end and said, "I just want everyone to know that my garden has never been better since Mr. Vaughn moved here. I don't care what anyone says. Those bees are a blessing to this neighborhood." There was genuine applause. It felt good to be appreciated rather than targeted. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following months. I continued my beekeeping, and my business actually grew. The publicity from the conflict, which had made it into the local news, led to several new contracts with farms and orchards in North Georgia. Apparently, the story of the HOA president trying to kill the neighborhood beekeeper had struck a chord with people. I got emails from other beekeepers sharing their own HOA horror stories. Karen moved away about 6 months after her conviction. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she'd sold her house and relocated to Florida. Good riddance, honestly. The neighborhood became noticeably more relaxed without her enforcement regime. The new HOA board under Patricia's leadership focused on actual issues like road maintenance and community events, rather than measuring mailbox heights. My favorite moment came the following spring. The HOA decided to expand the common area gardens, and Patricia asked if I'd consult on making them more pollinator-friendly. I helped them select plants that would provide good nectar and pollen sources throughout the growing season. We created a demonstration garden with educational signs explaining the importance of pollinators. On the day we dedicated the new garden, Tom Henderson gave a speech thanking me for my contributions to the neighborhood. He presented me with a jar of apple butter made from his tree's harvest, which he credited entirely to my bees. 3 years ago, these trees barely produced enough apples for a pie, he said. Last year, we harvested over 200 pounds. My wife made so much apple sauce and apple butter that we gave away jars to everyone on our street. That's the power of pollination, and that's why we're lucky to have Xavier and his bees as part of Meadowbrook Estates. People clapped. Kids ran around the new garden, already spotting bees and butterflies. Mrs. Chen was talking to another resident about starting a community vegetable garden, which I'd already agreed to help support with my hives. Standing there in the warm spring sunshine, listening to the buzz of my bees working the flowers, I felt genuinely grateful. Not for the conflict with Karen, I could have done without that, but grateful that it had forced the neighborhood to learn about and appreciate the small but crucial role my bees played in their daily lives. Most people never think about pollination. They see flowers and vegetables and fruits, and they don't consider the complex relationship between plants and pollinators that makes all of it possible. They don't realize that roughly 1/3 of the food we eat depends on pollinators, and that honeybees and other pollinators are facing serious challenges from habitat loss, pesticides, and disease. My 6 hives contained maybe 300,000 bees at their peak in summer. Those bees would visit millions of flowers over the course of a season, transferring pollen and enabling plant reproduction. They were the invisible workers that made gardens flourish and trees bear fruit. And now, finally, my neighbors understood and valued that contribution. The incident with Karen taught me something important too. It taught me that standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, is worth it. I could have given up and removed my hives. Some people would have, just to avoid the conflict. But I knew I was in the right, and I knew my bees were beneficial, so I fought back. It also taught me the importance of community. When the chips were down, my neighbors supported me. They spoke up at meetings, they shared their own positive experiences with the improved gardens, and they rejected Karen's fear-mongering. That solidarity made all the difference. I continued to expand my beekeeping operation gradually. I added 2 more hives the following year, and I started mentoring a young guy from the next subdivision over who wanted to learn beekeeping. I taught classes at the county extension office about pollinator-friendly gardening. I became involved in a statewide beekeepers association, advocating for policies that protect pollinators. The Meadowbrook Estates demonstration garden became a model for other subdivisions in the area. I got calls from HOA boards asking for advice on creating pollinator habitats in their communities. It was surreal to think that Karen's attempt to destroy my operation had inadvertently turned me into a local advocate for urban beekeeping. One afternoon in late summer, about 18 months after the whole conflict began, I was working in my apiary when I noticed a young family watching from the edge of my property. The parents were holding the hands of two small kids, maybe 4 and 6 years old. I walked over to say hello. "Sorry to bother you," the dad said. "We just moved in down the street, the Jacobsons' old place. We heard about your bees and my daughter is really interested in insects. We were hoping maybe we could see them sometime." "Of course," I said. "Let me grab my observation hive. It's a special box where you can see the bees safely." I brought out the observation hive and spent 20 minutes showing the kids how bees communicate through dancing, how they make honey, and how they help flowers grow. The little girl was entranced, pressing her face close to the glass to watch the bees work. The little boy was more interested in knowing if they could sting through the glass, which I assured him they couldn't. "This is so cool," the mom said. "We were worried when we heard there was a beekeeper in the neighborhood, but everyone we talked to said you're great, and the bees are wonderful for the area." "I'm glad the word is getting around," I said, smiling. After they left, I sat on my back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sun get lower in the sky. The bees were still working, making their last foraging runs of the day. In another hour, they'd all return to their hives for the night, clustering together for warmth and safety. I thought about Karen sometimes. I didn't hate her, surprisingly. I felt sorry for her in a way. She'd been so consumed by her need to control everything that she destroyed her own life when she encountered something she couldn't control. If she'd just left me alone, she'd still be living in her nice house, still be HOA president if that's what made her happy, still be part of the community. Instead, she'd let her anger and pride push her into criminal behavior. She tried to destroy my livelihood and my bees, creatures that were doing nothing but good for the neighborhood. And in the end, she'd only destroyed herself. There was probably a lesson in there about picking your battles and learning to live alongside people who are different from you. About recognizing that just because something makes you uncomfortable doesn't make it wrong. About understanding that you don't have to control everything and everyone around you. But Karen had never learned those lessons. Maybe she would now, in whatever new life she was building in Florida. I hoped so, for her sake and the sake of her new neighbors. As for me, I was exactly where I wanted to be. I had my bees, my business, and a community that finally understood and appreciated what I did. The hum of the hives was the soundtrack to my life, and I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. The fall came and went. I prepared my hives for winter, wrapping them in insulation and making sure the colonies had enough stored honey to survive the cold months. Georgia winters aren't terrible, but bees still need protection from the worst weather. During the winter months, when beekeeping slows down, I started working on an educational program with the local schools. The county school system was interested in teaching kids about pollinators and ecosystems, and they invited me to do presentations at elementary schools throughout the district. I developed a curriculum that was age-appropriate, interactive, and fun. The kids loved it. I'd bring in the observation hive and pass around empty honeycomb so they could feel the wax structure. I'd show them videos of bees doing their waggle dance to communicate. I'd explain how every third bite of food they ate was made possible by pollinators. And I'd talk about what they could do to help. Plant flowers, avoid pesticides, and appreciate the insects they saw in their yards instead of being afraid of them. Teachers told me that the presentation sparked genuine interest in science for many students. One teacher said a girl in her class, who'd been terrified of insects, did a whole independent project on bees after my visit, and was now planning to become an entomologist. That kind of impact meant more to me than any honey sales ever could. In early spring, as my bees began to emerge from their winter cluster and start foraging on the first flowers, I got an unexpected call. It was from a producer at a regional news station in Atlanta. They wanted to do a feature story about urban beekeeping and the importance of pollinators, and they'd heard about my work in Meadowbrook Estates. I was hesitant at first. I'm not someone who seeks attention. But I realized it was an opportunity to reach more people with the message about pollinator conservation. So I agreed. The news crew came out on a beautiful April morning. They filmed me working with the hives, interviewed several neighbors about the impact of the bees on their gardens, and shot footage of the demonstration garden in the common area. Patricia Donovan did an interview praising the bees and talking about how the HOA now supported pollinator-friendly initiatives. When the segment aired the following week, it was actually really well done. They told the story of how initial conflict had turned into community education and appreciation. They mentioned the legal issues with Karen, but didn't sensationalize it. Instead, they focused on the positive outcome, a neighborhood that now understood and valued its resident beekeeper. The segment got picked up by the state agricultural department and shared on their social media. Then, a national gardening website wrote an article about it. Suddenly, I was getting emails from people all over the country asking for advice on starting similar programs in their neighborhoods. I started a simple website where I shared basic information about urban beekeeping, dealing with HOAs, and creating pollinator habitats. I wasn't trying to become some kind of pollinator guru, but I wanted to help people who were facing similar challenges to what I'd faced. One email stuck with me. It was from a woman in Oregon who'd been threatened with fines by her HOA for keeping 2 beehives in her backyard. She'd read about my situation and wanted to know how I'd fought back. I spent an evening crafting a detailed response, sharing the legal research I'd done, the importance of documentation, and the strategy of educating rather than confronting when possible. A few months later, she emailed again. Her HOA had backed down after she'd presented similar documentation to what I'd used. She'd also invited board members to learn about her bees, and they'd been surprised by how gentle and beneficial the bees were. Now, her HOA was considering encouraging beekeeping rather than prohibiting it. Stories like that made all the hassle with Karen worthwhile. Every person who successfully stood up for their right to keep bees was helping to preserve these crucial pollinators. Every neighborhood that learned to appreciate rather than fear bees was contributing to a larger cultural shift. By the summer, my pollination business was thriving in ways I'd never expected. I had contracts with a dozen farms and orchards. I was supplying bees for pollination services to blueberry farms, apple orchards, and pumpkin patches throughout North Georgia. The income was better than it had ever been, and I was doing work I loved while supporting agriculture and food production. I hired an assistant, a college student named Marcus, who was studying environmental science at the University of Georgia. He'd seen my news segment and reached out asking if I needed help. Having an extra set of hands made the work easier and more efficient, and Marcus was eager to learn everything about beekeeping. "This is so different from what I expected," Marcus said one day while we were inspecting hives. "I thought bees would be aggressive and scary, but they're just doing their thing, not bothering anyone." "That's exactly it," I said. "Bees have been demonized in popular culture. Every movie shows killer swarms attacking people. But real bees are just trying to survive and reproduce like every other creature. They're not interested in humans unless we threaten them directly." I wish more people understood that. They're starting to, slowly. That summer was one of the best I'd ever had. The weather cooperated, with enough rain to keep flowers blooming but not so much that the bees couldn't forage. My hives were healthy and productive. I harvested over 300 pounds of honey, which I sold wholesale to local markets and restaurants. The neighborhood gardens were spectacular. Mrs. Chen's tomatoes were legendary, enormous heirloom varieties that she shared generously with anyone who admired them. The Hendersons had so many apples they organized a cider pressing party and invited the whole street. The common area demonstration garden was featured in a regional landscaping magazine as an example of sustainable, pollinator-friendly design. In August, the HOA organized a neighborhood picnic in the common area. It had become an annual tradition, but this year was special. Patricia asked if I'd be willing to do a honey tasting, where people could sample different varieties of honey from my hives. I set up a table with several kinds: spring wildflower honey, which was light and delicate, summer clover honey, which was rich and buttery, and sourwood honey, which came from bees I'd placed temporarily in the mountains and had a distinctive, spicy, sweet flavor. People were amazed at how different each variety tasted. "I had no idea honey could be this complex," one neighbor said, sampling the sourwood. "I thought honey was just honey." "Every honey reflects the flowers the bees visited," I explained. "It's like wine reflecting the terroir of where the grapes were grown. The soil, the climate, the specific plants, it all matters." Kids crowded around, and I let them taste tiny samples on little spoons. Several made faces at the sourwood, which was too sophisticated for young palates, but they loved the clover honey. One little boy asked if he could have bees when he grew up, and I told him absolutely. As the sun set and people started packing up, Tom Henderson pulled me aside. "Xavier, I just want you to know how much this neighborhood has changed since you moved here. And I don't just mean the gardens, though those are great. I mean the whole attitude. We used to be so focused on rules and appearances. Now we're focused on community and nature and actually enjoying where we live. Thank you for that." "I can't take all the credit," I said, "but I'm glad things worked out." "Oh, you can take plenty of credit. You stood up to Karen when the rest of us were too intimidated. You showed us that the HOA could be reasonable and supportive instead of just punitive. You made this a better place." I went home that evening feeling content in a deep, fundamental way. My bees were healthy, my business was successful, and my community valued what I did. It was everything I'd hoped for when I'd moved to Meadowbrook Estates 4 years earlier. The following year brought new challenges and opportunities. A major agricultural company approached me about supplying bees for large-scale pollination contracts. It would mean significantly expanding my operation, possibly beyond what I could manage on my current property. I talked it over with Patricia, explaining that I might need to move my main operation to a commercial location, but wanted to keep some hives in Meadowbrook Estates. She was incredibly supportive. "This is your business and your livelihood," she said. "You do what makes sense for you, but I hope you'll keep at least a few hives here. The neighborhood has really come to depend on them." I ended up leasing space at a small farm about 15 miles away where I could expand my operation. But I kept 6 hives at my house in Meadowbrook Estates, the same 6 that had started all the trouble with Karen. Those hives had become symbolic to me. They represented standing up for what was right and the community that had formed around that stand. Marcus graduated and took a job with the State Department of Agriculture, but he stayed involved with the bees on a part-time basis. I hired another assistant, a woman named Rachel who'd left a corporate job to pursue sustainable agriculture. She brought organizational skills that helped me manage the growing business effectively. 5 years after the incident with Karen, I was invited to speak at a national beekeeping conference in California. The organizers wanted me to talk about navigating legal and community challenges in urban beekeeping. My case had become somewhat well known in beekeeping circles as an example of successful advocacy. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of beekeepers from across the country, I told the story of Karen and the midnight attack on my hives, the HOA meetings, the community education efforts, and the transformation of Meadowbrook Estates into a pollinator-friendly neighborhood. The key lesson I want to share, I told the audience, is that education beats confrontation almost every time. Yes, I had to stand firm on my legal rights. But what really changed things was helping people understand why bees matter. Once my neighbors saw the impact on their gardens, once they learned about pollination and ecology, they became advocates instead of adversaries. We need to tell better stories about bees, about why they matter, about how they make our lives better. Fear is based on ignorance, and education is the cure for ignorance. The speech was well received. Afterwards, dozens of people approached me with their own stories, their own struggles with HOAs and local ordinances and fearful neighbors. I gave advice where I could, but mostly I just listened and encouraged them to keep fighting the good fight. Flying home to Georgia, I thought about how strange life is. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Estates just wanting a quiet place to keep my bees and do my work. I'd never intended to become an advocate or an educator or a minor public figure in the beekeeping world. But Karen's attack had forced me into that role, and it had turned out to be a blessing in disguise. How many more people understood pollination now because of what had happened? How many neighborhoods were more bee-friendly? How many kids had been inspired to appreciate insects instead of fear them? The ripples spread wider than I could measure. Back home, I visited my hives in the backyard. It was early spring again, and the bees were just starting to build up their populations after winter. I opened one hive for a quick inspection, checking for signs of disease or problems. Everything looked healthy. The queen was laying eggs in good patterns. The workers were bringing in pollen. The colony was thriving. A small voice called out from the fence. "Mr. Vaughn, are you working with the bees?" It was the little girl from down the street, the one whose family had moved in a few years ago. She was older now, maybe 9 or 10, and I'd heard she joined a 4-H beekeeping project. "I am," I called back. "Want to come see?" She ran to get her parents' permission and returned a few minutes later with a younger sibling in tow. I got them suited up in spare bee suits and let them look into the hive with me. The little girl's eyes were wide with wonder as she watched the bees moving across the frames. "They're so organized," she breathed. "Like they all know exactly what to do." "They do," I said. Every bee has a job based on its age and the colony's needs. It's one of nature's most sophisticated social systems. "I want to have my own hive someday." "You will," I assured her, "and you'll do great." After they left, I sat on my back porch with coffee, watching the bees fly in and out of their hive entrances. The afternoon sun was warm, and the air was filled with the smell of early spring flowers and the gentle sound of buzzing. This was my life now. Not just the bees and the business, but the teaching and the advocacy and the community building. It was bigger than I'd ever planned, but it felt right. Every challenge had led to something meaningful. Every setback had taught me something valuable. Karen had tried to destroy my operation, but instead she'd inadvertently helped it grow beyond anything I'd imagined. She'd forced me to fight back, to educate, to bring people together around a common appreciation for pollinators and nature. In trying to remove my bees, she'd made them the center of a community transformation. I never saw or heard from Karen again after she moved to Florida. I hoped she'd found some peace wherever she ended up. Holding on to anger and the need for control had destroyed her life in Meadowbrook Estates, and I genuinely hoped she'd learned from that experience. As for me, I was exactly where I needed to be. My bees buzzed contentedly in their boxes. My neighbors waved when they walked past, and my business supported not just me but the broader agricultural community and food production system. The hum of the hives was still the soundtrack to my life, but now it was also the heartbeat of a community that had learned to appreciate the small but crucial creatures that made so much of life possible. The story could have ended badly. Karen could have succeeded in poisoning my hives. The HOA could have sided with her and forced me out. My neighbors could have remained fearful and ignorant, but none of those things happened. Instead, education and persistence had won the day, and something beautiful had grown from the conflict. Standing there on my porch, coffee in hand, watching my bees fly off to pollinate the flowers of Meadowbrook Estates, I felt grateful for all of it. The good and the bad, the challenges and the victories, the fear and the education. It had all led here to this moment of peace and purpose. The bees didn't know any of this, of course. They just flew their paths, collected their pollen and nectar, built their comb, and raised their young. They did what bees had done for millions of years, indifferent to human drama and politics. And maybe that was the final lesson, that nature continues regardless of our conflicts, and our job is simply to protect and appreciate it rather than trying to control or destroy it. The sun was getting lower now, and the bees were returning to their hives for the night. Soon it would be quiet, except for the evening birds and the rustle of wind through the trees. Another day was ending, another day of pollination and growth and life continuing its ancient patterns. I finished my coffee and went inside, content and at peace, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same. More bees, more neighbors, more opportunities to teach and learn and appreciate the intricate web of life that we're all part of. And I wouldn't have wanted it any other way.